Hello and welcome to Singapore FinTech Festival, brought to you by the DIT in partnership with 11FS, Innovate Finance and the City of London Corporation. I'm Gemma Godfrey, Non-Executive Director at IWP and a serial FinTech entrepreneur, and I'm joined by Group CEO of 11FS, David Brear. How's it going, David?
Really good. Another couple of great sessions as well. So lots and lots and lots of stuff to talk about.
We always had a really good Q&A this morning, but I just want to dig into the sessions that we've just heard, which absolutely are very fascinating. So, and also for everyone that's watching, we will get to your questions as well. So please do keep them coming in and we'll cover them in the second half of this session. So to kick off, we're going to turn to this session that we saw, Rising to the Challenge, Regulatory Innovation, and that isn't an oxymoron, amidst a global pandemic. And so for this session, we heard from Nick Cook, Director of Innovation at the FCA. We heard from Louise Eggert, the Head of FinTech Hub at the Bank of England, and Sopnendu Mahanti, who is the Chief FinTech Officer at the Monetary Authority in Singapore. So we obviously heard William Russell, the Lord Mayor of London as well, who was hosting it very expertly. And he opened the session talking about the challenging year that we've had, which obviously we all understand at home, and it's now more than ever that fintechs will have a central role, and we're obviously seeing that with the fact that people aren't able to go out and about as much as they were before, that people are using obviously digital currencies, digital payments. So do you think that this is a real turning point for fintech?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I mean, I know I was impressed with Mark Carney's home office earlier on. The Lord Mayor's sort of fireplace was pretty impressive, wasn't it? So that's just to start with, like you say, you did a very good job of sort of running the panel and some real heavy hitters on there. I think in terms of really, as we were sort of talking about a little bit earlier on, Gemma, I think the acceleration that we've seen in the agenda from a banking perspective, both in terms of what the big incumbents, but also the gaps and the opportunities that are opening up for fintech. I think that really is shown that there is a great acceleration. I know there was some points that were touched on as well in terms of funding side of things, but there is no way we are done with fixing all of the different elements of financial services. So there's definitely a great opportunity, and entrepreneurial spirit will always be looking for those opportunities as well.
And it's interesting because I think a lot of people that were watching were probably, drooling at the numbers that Sopnendu was talking about. He was saying some unbelievable figures are for Singapore this year. So Singapore has already seen, he was saying, $1.3 billion in fintech investment this year, and 50% of that is for fintechs that help small businesses and banks digitize. So this is obviously a huge shift. Give us some light, some optimism. Do you think we could start to see that type of acceleration in the UK?
Definitely. I think globally, I think it's a trend that we're sort of seeing. It's that move from the early days was B2C, and it was, the retail banks are going to, take over, and it was all of this sort of, competition rather than collaboration. But I honestly, we've been saying for the last couple of years, I think the B2B place is far more interesting, because we sort of start getting into those deep-seated fabric of financial services pieces, whether it is, the core banking sense, or all of these pieces that are, they are £1 trillion problems for the banks in individual, terms. But when you sort of pull that all together as an ecosystem globally, then there is massive opportunity. So I really think the B2B fintech space really is only just getting going. We have seen early days of organizations like Stripe, really sort of take held. But I think it just harking back to some of the things that even Rishi was saying with some of the opening pieces around what Oak North's strategy is. Actually, if you can do B2C and pivot to B2B in the way that an organization like Oak North does, then you can kind of have your cake and eat it. You can prove your model works and then solve it for you, but then solve it for hundreds of other organizations as well. And I think there's a really sensible strategy in that. It's really, I mean, if you look at what somebody like AWS have done, Amazon built AWS for them, it solved their problems, and then it solved a lot of other people's problems doing it as well.
Absolutely. And if you do it that way around as well, it's an easier sell, because you're validating the need. You're validating it. You're showing the technology works.
Yeah.
Why don't you be the guinea pig, and then you can monetize it as well. So I mean, I've done that as well myself, and I think it's a really strong strategy. So if we look at that and we say that there is therefore an opportunity in the UK to be able to leverage this, how can the UK ensure that it stays ahead with open? I mean, we've heard about open banking, for so long. Obviously we're starting to see it being implemented and things like that. But how can the UK stay not just keeping up, but like ahead of the game in terms of fintech innovation, do you think?
Yeah, I think we've already started to see, some of the sort of stretching of the topics around what obviously open banking was sort of cooked up off the back of PSD2 and everything that was there. But also, I mean, Imran and the team over there are looking at what the next steps are for that, and actually how, sweeps and all different types of capability can really sort of change that dynamic. And I think, continually pushing to, set the agenda from a global perspective, I think is really sensible. I think what we sort of heard a little bit out of the comments from the Bank of England, MAS, and the FCA is that collaboration is increasingly becoming more and more important. And I think we all sort of gravitate to the really sort of sexy parts of this in terms of the exciting new shiny technology. But I think Nick made a really good point around things like even just the amount of fraud that's happening. This doesn't happen just in one geo; it's happening in between geographies. And money laundering. We're getting 1% of the levels from a money laundering perspective, and only through collaboration between the regulators are we going to start to sort of tighten up that net a little bit on some really terrible practices, terrible people doing really harmful things. So it fills me with hope to see such progressive regulators in that sense, but I guess we've still got a long way to go.
I mean, it's interesting because that kind of leads nicely onto a question we got asked on Nick's topic, talking about the area of growth in digital identity. But what's interesting about digital identity is, as you said, is that it's also been taken advantage of. So yes, we can see lots of innovation come about, but at the same time, people are very sensitive around their own data. You've got GDPR coming in. And I think that's actually a really good example of where we could see innovation, but oh my God, the regulation has to obviously, stay up to scratch with that as well. I mean, what do you think about that? Do you think it's an enabler of future innovation?
I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because the regulators are often seen as like the rule book, but actually very often they're going much further beyond that. We're talking about that underlying sort of fabric again of what financial services is. I mean, if we started a central regulator and a financial system in a new place right now, identity, payments, real-time settlement systems, all of these things would be basic things that you would expect. It's really interesting. I mean, if you look at the regulators and central government, central banks, really they're going through a very similar transformation that the banks are themselves. And actually, most banks are finding that you're having to start greenfield technology projects to really solve these deep-seated problems. But it's great to see them take more of an active role in that. I think often the regulators are sort of put in a position where they have to let the market make the decisions around these things. But increasingly, where we've seen PSD2, open banking, even much more wide-reaching projects or regulations around data, it is dramatically setting the agenda for the industry and making the whole industry move forward. So I think identity plays such a massive part. Identity plays such a huge part in access to financial services and the maintenance of financial services in a big way. And it's good to see, I think, the MAS and the FCA, the Bank of England, playing a big role in moving that forward.
I mean, it's really interesting, actually, when you talk about that as well, because one of the trends that I found fascinating is that a lot of the tech companies now are going out to the universities and saying, in 3 years' time, these are the skill sets that we need. Therefore, you need to be offering these types of degrees now to get the workforce that we need for the future. So I absolutely agree that we need to have that planning going forward. And we had a question in, which is really interesting, because it actually links to one of the questions that we had in our previous session around tax and innovation, things like that. So just to recap, anybody that didn't catch it, somebody asked, should we be providing tax incentives, to make sure that people are benefiting from being able to invest in green projects? And someone has likewise said, do you think the regulators should be doing more to incentivize digital adoption by larger institutions? So again, we're not talking about tax there, we're talking about the regulator, but do you think they're doing enough to really encourage and force the needle for the larger institutions?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one. I mean, again, large scale changes within organizations from the outside look very rational, from the inside are often very emotional. And actually, often what you'll sort of find is that the people with sort of big interests in maintaining branch networks or telephony networks will do so. And I think a lot of the CEOs that we've seen today, we've seen Jess with Barclays. Barclays are one of the organizations that I think have really empowered their the transformation of channel, going from branch networks and telephony to digital channels, with all of the things that they've done around digital legals and all of the different changes that they put there. So it is difficult, because sometimes you're asking, turkeys to vote for Christmas a little bit in terms of skill sets and changes that are there. But ultimately, I think the CEOs of the organizations know which way the future is going. And from my perspective, that is digital.
Absolutely. I mean, it was interesting because also the panel kind of had, that we heard, especially in that first session, cited the same problems around cross-border payments, about that being an issue. And obviously, we're here today talking about collaboration. So it's interesting that we've seen fintechs like TransferWise offer a service. But do you think that also that maybe central banks have a place in this as well, to make this kind of an obligation to ensure that we can collaborate globally and have cross-border payments? Or do you think that's overstepping? I mean, because there is a balance to be met.
I mean, I think it's a difficult ask to expect the regulator to provide all of the sort of plain pieces for the industry to move forward on, because of exactly what I've just said a second ago. I feel like the industry as a whole is evolving towards a really truly digital future, rather than actually, look, we've got all of the pieces in place and it's about building blocks to build banks on top of, essentially. If you did rethink how all of these things would work, then yes, digital identity and cross-border payments would be a unified system. I mean, I think if we were going to try and fix blank sheets of paper, first principles trying to fix anti-money laundering, then, well, we'd start enforcing all banks have similar policies, similar structures, so comparable data sets would be working. But obviously, we're not in that place where we can just stop and reset all of these things. So I think as we evolve and we understand more and more how much we want central regulators to play more control points, there was some good points around central digital currencies and how that manifests itself from MAS. I think if we were starting from a different place, then all of those things, I think, would be fundamental building blocks of a digital regulator, a digital central governing body. But how we get from where we are to that is going to be quite a long, winding road, I suspect. I think the really exciting thing, if I'm honest with you, is that this is on their agenda. They are thinking about these things. This is not a collection of regulators that are needing to be educated. I mean, the Lord Mayor knows that Bitcoin exists and is skyrocketing from a pricing perspective. Like, we are so far through the looking glass when it comes to this becoming mainstream on the impact of day-to-day regulation, and that's fantastic. This is a great sign from my perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that as an example. I thought that's fantastic. So I don't want us to run out of time. So let's go on to the second session, which we're going to talk about, which is session 4, which it was the one where we had Natalie Black, who moderated it, between Lim-Eng Lee, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at Razor Inc. and CEO of Razor FinTech, and Willem Pozaz, who is the founder and CEO of Checkout.com. So this is all about becoming global. So again, very, very relevant to what we're talking about here, especially from the perspective of the UK and Singapore. And we also had the importance of choosing the partner. And by the way, as somebody who's sold a fintech, into an incumbent, I absolutely categorically agree with this. Choosing a partner that matches your chemistry and is aligned to your long-term visions is absolutely critical. Although I'm kind of leading the witness there. But how do you think, that you can get that chemistry, especially when we're talking about things like globally? I mean, I was very fortunate that, I was doing things round a table in the UK and we really hashed it out. And I personally believe that having good communication, transparency, and making sure that you actually have a full business plan is really critical to where you want to see things go. But when you're talking about doing this on a global strategy and a global level, how do you think you can build that partner chemistry to get that right?
Yeah, I mean, look, you've got as much experience of this one as I do, Gemma, and I completely agree with exactly what you said. It's difficult, isn't it? I mean, particularly in this period where everybody's, at the end of a Zoom call or something, it's creating that relationship and truly understanding what people are. It's like getting into a relationship that, getting married and getting engaged. I mean, you're sort of doing that with the best intent, aren't you? But I think the hard thing is, I mean, I think a lot of banks say partnership when they mean procurement, and I think the really the cornerstone of good relationships is communication. It's being able to push back and say when you think something is wrong or when you think things are going really well. And actually, I think almost the boundaries that you set in a good relationship, a good partnership, really need to be thrashed out at the beginning, don't they? Yeah. So I think a lot of sort of testing of that one to make sure you're in the right position. I mean, from 11FS's perspective, we sort of push back on people quite hard on those things, just because essentially your common interest is the thing. You want to get the business to be successful, but it's by far is it an easy thing to do. But I think it starts on that basic principles of great communication, being really honest in terms of the things that you want to do and the things that you can get to, and maintaining that all the way through.
I agree, and actually, just taking that analogy forward, as somebody that's been divorced, so I know exactly when relationships go right and when they go wrong as well. If we take that forward as well, it is all about, I think, being really realistic. So a lot of times when you try and do a deal, you want the deal to work, and even when both sides want the deal to work, same thing as a relationship, that's fine. But it doesn't necessarily form a really stable basis for a successful partnership going forward. It's about honesty, about what does each company bring to the table. So from my perspective, when I had that with my business, it was really strong technology, but really what I was valuing around the partner and the acquiring firm was really around the distribution. And as soon as that was acknowledged and that could work together, I think that made things a lot simpler in terms of each other's remits and how you'd work together. So I think that's great. I mean, and it's interesting because, again, we're talking about here, businesses and how they grow, and obviously the next generation of, everybody wants to be a unicorn these days. And so, you've got Willem's prediction that as a result of the pandemic, 5 years from now, we'll have a whole new batch of these unicorns. And obviously unicorns are magical figures here. They're necessarily, as common as you'd think. But anyway, it's interesting. Do you agree with his prediction that we're going to have a whole new batch of unicorns? But I'm going to split that question up. Do we think it's going to accelerate it? So we're going to have unicorns in 5 years' time. But also, do we think that they're going to be driven by the pandemic? Do we think the pandemic has accelerated the need for digital technology, which will then, accelerate the growth of substantial, businesses going forward?
Yeah, I'd say definitely the pandemic has accelerated the opportunity, but also I think it's bizarrely, I mean, there's no good time to have a global pandemic, but I'd say from a finance perspective, we know there are huge amounts of funds that are out there looking to be deployed. I think people are looking for organizations that have shown good track records that are looking to scale right now, and particularly if you've done something particularly well in one geography, there's enough VC money out there that actually would bet in different geographies that things really sort of accelerating. So again, look, it's a thinnest of thin silver lining around what's happening with COVID, but it is definitely, dramatically accelerating the digital agenda. And because of that, I think, particularly as we were sort of going back to on the earlier session, the B2B sense, I think the investments that we're going to see in the B2B sense, and therefore the acceleration that we'll see around solving some of those problems for the big incumbent organizations, but more broadly than that. I mean, if you look at Razor and checkout.com, what is financial services in itself is getting broader and broader and broader. In Singapore, we've just seen Grab get a full license over there as part of the changes that we've seen. So, Grab being a transportation company, financial services is just being increasingly embedded into everything. And because of that, the addressable market and therefore the investment potential is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I think we're both quite excited about that though, Gemma. I think in weird times like this, entrepreneurs always look for opportunity, don't they?
Absolutely. Honestly, it does, as you said, to be able to use technology in the right way, that it enables and it facilitates the ability to be able to service customers better across. And I've always been passionate about that. People think of financial services, but you can use that model and that technology across a whole range of different providers. And there's a financial element to so many services out there that I absolutely agree. I think this is a really big growth area. So talking about again the UK's position within that, and talking about being global, but also being local. If we just delve a little bit into that, and that was obviously something that was talked about in the session. How important is it to have that local presence to bring to a global market? And we heard a lot about the fact that the UK is so open-minded. Do we think that that's really important? Do we think that will help the UK in order to be able to exploit as many and leverage as many of these opportunities globally by pairing up local talent and local capabilities on a global scale?
Definitely. I think, particularly as organizations expand, I think many people forget business is just people, people doing business with other people. The cultural differences in, what people's expectations are, or what is business practice in one country and not in another, and how these things, I think all of that is often really overlooked when you're, a FinTech looking to take over the world. There is nuances that I think is critical to understand. And actually, I think that's where, the bridges that have really been established between different geos on different parts of the world are really critical to be in a situation where actually that transition and those translations between businesses and how it's done to make it a lot smoother. Because I think great technology gets you a long way, but how business is done in each of these geos is subtly but fundamentally different.
Absolutely. Well, actually, I mean, we've just been going ahead there, and we almost ran out of time now, actually. And there's so much more we could talk about. And thanks everybody for their questions. So that is all the time that we have. But thank you so much for all of your questions and for joining us today. And thank you so much to David for joining me here live from Singapore FinTech Festival 2020. I hope you've enjoyed today's content as much as we have. Clearly, thank you very much, and bye for now.